So, I'm gonna unbox this Stay Wet palette from Masterson's. um, this is gonna be my third wet palette, my second brand name palette, and I wasn't really looking to make this a feature that I do very often, and it's still not the plan. But I felt like I needed to get a different palette. I've been using the Army Painter wet palette, and it's fine. Except there's a couple of quibbles that I have with it that I don't know whether it's me or the palette. Since I've only been doing using a wet palette for a couple of months, I'm far from an expert. But I noticed a couple of things about that palette that made it less than pleasant to use. So one of the things is that when you have a bit of paint in your wet palette and you got to open it for the first time, it's very easy for the lid to fall into the reservoir of the paint reservoir. I'll show you. Here is my Army Painter wet palette. It's I let this dry. I was away from home for a couple of days, visiting the significant other, and a faithful watcher of this channel. Thanks, honey. So here's what happened. So let's just pretend this is in here, and I've got a load of paints. So I go in. Like, okay, I've been away for a little while from my painting. I'm going to get back to it. I go to open it. And this lid and brush holder kind of combination, it's not that it's not tight. It's that when I go to open it, you see how it kind of goes into the reservoir? And, you can kind of see some spots where there's paint on the lid, and that's exactly how that happens. It kind of goes in and it scoops up stuff. It's not a huge deal, right? I don't care what this looks like so much. I mean, I'd like to keep my stuff kind of pretty and kind of clean, but when I go in here, it'll go in there and it'll kind of it'll mess up the paints that are in there. And again, not that I'm doing a ton of complex mixtures and whatever. I can always replace them, but that means I have to junk all the paint that's on here, or at least kind of work my way around it. It's just an inconvenience. The other thing that I've noticed is that the sponge, the water, I guess let's call it a sponge. The sponge part of this, I don't know if it's the thickness or what, but it dries really quickly. Relative to the other wet palette that I had, that kind of junky, no-name wet palette. So within, I don't know, an hour or two, I noticed that my paints are getting dry and sticky. And also the water that's in this reservoir, it'll evaporate, or it'll go away, whether it's evaporating or going into the paints, who knows, right? But it'll evaporate pretty quickly, and so I'll have to go into the corners and try to recharge it. The water in the reservoir doesn't stay there very long. So I think it's a combination of how much water this relatively thin sponge will retain and how quickly it'll evaporate. So this is not an objective comparison. This isn't a review. These are just observations that I'm having that make it. See, there's another place where this thing spilled into this reservoir. So I don't know. So the junky one, the no name, the no brand wet palette that I used to have, it was hinged so that when I opened it, it would always open this way, right? So there was no risk of it ever getting in there. So I don't know that a different wet palette is going to have a feature where the lid is shaped in such a way that it can't fit in to the reservoir. It'd be nice if the lid was bigger, and so there was really, unless you tried hard to get in there, you're not going to get in there. So I went back and I looked at those videos of people kind of reviewing wet palettes, and I decided to try this guy for a couple of reasons. The Masterson brand seems to be one of the common ones that people use. Not necessarily this specific model. The really good model painters are going to use like a huge wet palette because they do all kinds of blends and crazy stuff with paint colors that I don't have it in me. I don't have that skill level yet. Maybe someday I'll get there, but I'm not there yet. So they tend to have good experiences with this palette, and particularly the sponge, which is one of the areas of weakness that I noticed with the other palette. So here it is, the Masterson Stay Wet palette. I'm going to give this a shot to see if I like this better. So the other reason I got this one is not just was it the brand that other people seem to be really comfortable with, but also it was cheap. It was like $12. I think it's because it's a small one and it doesn't have a bunch of the other sponges and papers or whatever. So I'm going to try this. Here it is. It's the Masterson's Stay Wet Handy Palette. It's the smaller size. I think this is 8.5 by 7 inches. So 8.5 by 7. The material, it's just plastic. It doesn't have it doesn't feel particularly well put together. It's just common plastic. The Army Painter one was a little bit, I want to say higher quality, maybe more rigid, a more pleasant texture. It looks a little more professional. So here it is. Let's see. So in the package was this kind of product description. You have some basic directions, helpful hints. I will read through these because I don't want to keep having to buy different palettes. All right, so there's some tabs here to open it. Okay, and so there it is. It does not have a recyclable sign on this or on this. And inside you have the sponge, which really I think is the heart of this device. So you have this guy, you have the sponge. It feels like, I don't know, it's a different texture. It feels about as thick, honestly, as the Army Painter one. Okay, it's a little thicker than the Army Painter one. Maybe that'll make a difference. I don't know. And this is the paper. Oh. So one of the things I read when I was researching what alternative wet palettes to buy was something about the paper is specifically designed for acrylic paints. And because yeah, it does not feel like parchment paper. Parchment paper, it tends to have like a smoothness to it. This doesn't have that. It's kind of, it has a different texture to it. And it's much thicker than the other papers. I don't know if it would translate to the camera, but like you'll see there's a rigidity there to it, right? The other parchment papers that I've used, they kind of droop, and they feel almost like wax paper, even though they're not wax paper. So this is a very different kind of paper. So I'm wondering if the combination of the slightly thicker sponge, maybe a slightly different manufacturer, or maybe has different qualities, properties, combined with the different paper. I'm hoping that this would be that this will help keep my paints a little more damp, a little more moist. And I mean, it's a deeper reservoir, deeper I think than the Army Painter, but the sponge is still pretty thin, so I may not be able to add a lot of water. I don't want it to go over this thing because it'll wash out these paints, but we'll see. We will see. It's definitely deeper. Oh, is it? Let's see. Well, it's definitely bigger than the Army wet palette. The size isn't something that I was looking for. Pardon the dog hair. And it looks slightly deeper than the Army Painter reservoir. Not a lot. I mean, fractions of an inch. But, you know, the deepness of it wasn't really what I was having problems with, since I couldn't use most of that deepness since the sponge was thinner. I wonder. So here's what I'm going to try. If this doesn't work out the way I want to, what I'll do is I'll try to add a second sponge. If I just can't retain enough water, I'll try a second sponge and put it right over this one, and that way I could add more water to the reservoir. Maybe that's going to help. And I'm afraid that maybe I got my start on a thick wet palette, which is, you know, not necessarily industry standard, and that has basically set my expectations in a different place, in a place that they don't really belong. That the actual wet palette experience is going to be closer to something like this. So I don't know what the case is. The paper definitely feels different. All right, I'm gonna use this guy over the next couple of days, and hopefully it will be a better experience. Yeah, I'm trying to see if I can cause it to slide into my paint reservoir when I open it. And so there is still some risk of that, it looks like. But I think these whiter ridges are going to help me avoid that. At least it's going to reduce the frequency with which I get my... Oh, see there, it happened. So I'm thinking it's not going to eliminate this problem, the scooping problem, but it might reduce its occurrence, which, you know, I'll take it. Wish me luck, guys. I'm apprehensive. I'm hopeful that this is going to be what I'm looking for. I don't want to spend $70 on a really nice wet palette and then find out that it's going to have the same trouble that I'm having now, because the trouble is me, not the wet palette. Stay tuned, I guess. I've had a chance to use this for a couple of days, and I'm actually pretty satisfied so far. I mean, it's just been a couple of days. I haven't even finished a complete project with it yet, but I'm working on a vehicle, and you know, so one of the interesting things about this is the paper that they provide. They only provide 5 sheets, which I thought was kind of on the cheap side. The past 2 pallets that I've purchased came with 50 sheets. The thing is, so they say, oh yeah, this is a special kind of paper. You can rinse it off and reuse it. It's going to be stained, but it's not going to come off on your paints. I'm not 100% convinced of that yet. This is the first time I've washed it. I mean, I feel like there's some paint there. Yeah, see, some of it's kind of coming off. on my finger. Yeah, it's kind of rubbing off. Okay, so maybe I need to wash it again. But the idea was that it's a thick enough paper that you can use the paper again a number of times. And I thought that was a pretty neat deal. It's not a deal breaker for me buying paper. It's not that expensive, but there's some of us, that were trying to do this on a budget, and it's a couple of bucks you don't have to spend. That's neat, and it also cuts down on waste. So far, I'm pretty happy with the performance of it. It is pretty wet. It keeps my paints nice and wet. Certainly longer than the Army Painter wet palette that I had been using. It's a nice size. It's not too big for me. I'm not that good a painter. I don't need a big honking thing. This is the right size for me. The lid opens and closes, A, very securely, but B, in such a way that it doesn't fall into this reservoir. At least it hasn't happened to me yet. I've been painting for a couple of hours, and I've been opening and closing it, and I have yet to have an inadvertent kind of dragging the thing into the paint. And this next thing isn't a complaint. It's an observation, and it's an alert for some of you who maybe you go out and you get yourself one of these and you don't read the directions all the way. The instructions say that you have to prepare this paper. The preparation here means you have to soak it for like 5 minutes in warm water. That apparently gets the paper nice and saturated, and then you can use it. I don't know what happens if you don't do that. I can't imagine it'd be that much of a difference, but since it was in the instructions, I figured I'm going to go ahead and do it. And so I changed out the water today, not to do the review. The review happened just because I happened to wash it off. Not the review, but this commentary. And there is a little bit of staining on the sponge, but it's okay. Like it's not bad. I'm gonna rinse this off one more time, see if I can get rid of some of this extra paint. I don't know if you can tell, but it is dragging off my finger, and if it's dragging off my finger, it's gonna drag off into my other paints, and I don't want that. So let me see. So I rinsed it off again, hit it with an old medium stiffness, medium bristled toothbrush, and I think I got most of the paint that was gonna try to make an exit. Yeah, it's gone. So yeah, I don't know how much a piece of paper for this costs. I'll look it up and I'll put it on the screen, kind of like now. Does that work? Did it work? Yes? No? Maybe? Anyway, I was having fun with the camera there a little bit. You don't have to buy a new piece of paper if you're doing it on a budget. Just reuse it. But just know that it is going to stain, obviously. And, if you don't use the same paints on there, it's going to maybe confuse your eyeball. For me, I'm not a big mixer of paints. I'm not there yet. So, what's on the bottom, the color of the stain isn't really going to mess with me all that much. So I might reuse it a couple of times, but then again, I'm also kind of a snob, and I will probably unnecessarily throw this paper away. Either way, it's a very high quality grade of paper. I could absolutely see why people use this wet palette. After a couple of hours of using it, I haven't found any obvious problems with it. So if you're kind of kicking it around, I got it for $12 on Amazon. It was less expensive than the Army Painter. I'd go with it. Absolutely. I have no problems recommending it. I'm not saying it's the best out there. I have no basis for comparison. But this is a pretty sweet palette. And those were words I never thought I'd say. This was supposed to be just an unboxing video, but I kind of delayed editing this footage for quite a bit, and it's now been a month. I bought the Masterson Stay Wet palette in early January, and I've been using it ever since. It's now middle of February, so I've had it for about a month, and in that time I've got to know my little wet palette pretty well. I've finished a couple of projects with it so far, and so I was finally editing the video, and I thought, well, maybe some additional comments wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. So instead of it being an unboxing video, it's just going to be a, hey, look what I got, and here's what I think. I need to think of a catchy name for that. Anyway, so after a good couple of weeks of use, I'm still using the Masterson's wet palette. I haven't gone back to my other two, and I haven't had any of the problems I thought it might. Like, I haven't done any of that paint scooping problem that I originally was my motivation to get the Masterson's wet palette, and everything works pretty well. It's sufficiently wet enough that it keeps my paints wet for a while. Although I did just now buy another sponge. As I was reviewing the footage, I realized that I'd already talked about getting a second one, so maybe doubling up on the sponges gave me more volume of water so it could stay wetter longer. It was a good idea then. It's a good idea now, so I'm going to do it. I don't know if that's going to work, but I'm pretty sure it will. The only modification I want to make to my recommendation is that, yes, I recommend it. Right? It's the best palette I've used so far in terms of the container and the sponge. My only reservation right now is the paper. I stopped using the paper that came with the Masterson's wet palette. I don't know, it was drying out my paints really quickly. It was drying it out within an hour, and that's after I prepared it, let it sit in a warm water bath for 15 minutes. It was still drying out my paints, and it was an unpleasant experience. Which is weird because everyone else, all the other reviews that I've read, everyone loves that paper. I love the thickness. I don't like that I have to see the stains from the previous painting on there, and I just don't like that it seems to dry off my paints. I may be using it wrong. It could all be me. Absolutely, I'll take ownership of that. But I've gone and I've tried. I just used one of the random wax parchment paper that I had lying around from my other two wet palettes, and so right now I'm using the paper that came with the Army Painter wet palette, ironically enough, and that seems to be doing a good job. So the combination of the Masterson's wet palette with the Army Painter wet palette paper, that seems to do the trick for me. It's and yes, the new paper doesn't last as long. I have to replace it more frequently, and if I have it for too long and I'm stirring, I use a metal stirrer to kind of stir the paints as they kind of settle. It'll tear through the paper. It's not a danger that I think I ever experienced with the Masterson's paper. I guess what I'm saying here is that I love the palette. I don't love the paper, but switching off the paper is relatively inexpensive, and that seems to be doing a good job for me so far. So there it is. It's a recommendation still, maybe a little qualified. The idea is that maybe you have to mix and match, experiment to suit your personal preferences. I'd like to say that there's nothing wrong with it. There probably isn't, but that means you're spending a bit more money, a bit more time. But exploration, it's part of this hobby too. It's not just about painting awesome minis and putting them in the fake battlefield. So there it is. Just my impressions. I'll continue to use the Masterson's wet palette until I get an itch that I just can't stop scratching, and I'll get something else. But for now, It's Masterson's. Yeah.